Our seminar room is room number 4, and we have some very interesting presentation. One is about utilizing generative AI to simulate third place learning dialogues. This one will be presented by Mara Alagic. I hope I pronounce well her surname. She's coming from Kansas in the United States. And this research is about generative artificial intelligence, and also is discussing about dialectic thinking, intercultural sensitivity, and how a third place learning dialogue can be used, and also an analysis of that scenario, of some scenarios, using generative AI. This is our first presentation. I would like to give the floor to Mara Alagic to present the paper.
Hello, everybody. Let me share my, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. I just need a second to find my PowerPoint because it's hiding, but it's here now. Okay, very nice to be here. Exciting times with the changes that are happening, and I really enjoyed our first keynote. I would like first to share the story behind this project. I'm a mathematician and math educator, and I also have like a solid background in computer science. However, I also have a genuine and compelling interest in intercultural and global communication, and I have done some research in that area. So in 2008, I had a book published with my colleague Glenn Remington. The title of the book is Third Place Learning, a Reflective Inquiry into Intercultural and Global Cage Painting. That's the place where my story starts related to this presentation today. When we got the book published, we went to Japan to do a workshop on intercultural communication using the theoretical background that we proposed in that book. That was an interesting experience, as you can guess, because of significant cultural differences. By the way, my colleague is an Australian, and I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Coming to the States, we both had different cultural clashes, so that was something that we were always interested in. It wasn't so surprising to experience some new cultural clashes once in Japan, but it was a learning experience that propelled further our research and interest in third place learning. What do we mean by a third place learning? We mean that interaction between two people or two groups of people that brings us to a shared understanding over a disorienting dilemma of supposedly contradictory perspectives. So a simple example that I will say more about this is punctuality. We don't all have the same sense of time, and being on time means different things to different cultures. So that becomes a disorienting dilemma that might be necessary to discuss to find shared language and agreement about working together on collaborative projects. Over the years, I have published many collaborative papers and worked with many graduate students to understand better how these processes work. Starting from a disorienting dilemma to get to the place of mutual third place learning or understanding, and what conditions need to be satisfied along the way to accomplish these tasks. We call these conditions relational criteria, and I will say more about it in this presentation. With artificial intelligence becoming so prominent in whatever we do these days, we are compelled to consider how these third-place learning processes can be successfully supported through the use of general artificial intelligence. The task is daunting, the idea is simple. Or to say vice versa, the idea is simple, but the task is daunting. So in this presentation, I dive deeply into the TPL relational criteria exploration through the use of Copilot, mainly Copilot, although I played with other AI tools. So this is my tentative outline, and reflective inquiry refers to something that I have just shared. So for the structure of the presentation, I will present the third place learning theoretical framework with relational criteria, while along the way sharing what I was teaching Copilot about and what
Hi,
Copilot...
excuse me, ma'am. Are you also already sharing your screen? I think that is frozen now. Could you start? Yeah.
Is it
No,
moving
I
now?
saw your mouse. Yes. Could you just using the presentation part and to sharing your all the PowerPoint?
So are you seeing tentative outline slide?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm talking about that slide right now.
Okay. Super great. Thank you.
Sure. So I wanted to give a little bit more introduction because before I start rushing through the slides, if that's making sense. So for the structure of presentation, I will present the third place learning theoretical framework with relational criteria, while along the way sharing what I was teaching Copilot about it and what Copilot was teaching me about the third place learning and relational criteria. So let me just share a small vignette. After many instances of using third place learning as a phrase, I introduced the acronym TPL and used it a couple of times successfully. Copilot recognized what I was thinking about TPL, but at some point it switched and said TPL means teach, plan, learn. When corrected, I got an apology actually. So it was an interesting interaction. So to summarize, to quickly go over the abstract, this is the theoretical investigation to explore the potential of generative AI in simulating third place learning dialogues framed within a communicative space of the following relational dimensions: active listening, holistic mindfulness, the term Bodymindfulness is also used, dialectic thinking, critical co-reflection, intercultural sensitivity, and conscientization. So this is just my abstract. I wanted to have it handy, but let me go to the next slide. So what is the potential of...
I'm so sorry to disturb you. Are you still in the first slide or are you going to... Which
No.
slide? Yeah.
I'm in the slide, what is the potential of generative AI?
So the first slide or second one?
No, actually, it's the fourth one. So I'm not sure why are you asking me that question. So let me just quickly go. This is my title slide. Can you see it?
We cannot see. Could you refresh your slides, like your all the presentation, and we can...
Okay.
You can stop sharing and to reshare it again. Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay. Can you see my slides now?
Yes. And could you go into the second slide? Yes. Now I think everyone will be perfect.
So
And
you,
yes, now is second.
I was trying to use the presentation mode so that you don't see all of this. Is that a problem?
Yes.
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 So you want me to stay in this format where you can see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine for me. It's actually even easier.
Yes.
So basically, I was starting to talk about this slide.
Yes. Perfect. We can continue.
Okay, sure. So, as I mentioned, I've been playing with generative AI, with the GPT, and universities providing, Microsoft Copilot. So most of this work has been done with Copilot. And if you played with it or if you used it, you recognize how some of these patterns are happening. So when I ask the question, what is the potential of generative AI in simulating third-place learning dialogues framed within a communicative space, this is the response that I got. I will say that that was not my first entry. I tried first to search to see if Copilot is familiar with the third place learning concept. And it did actually quote one of my papers, but not the book. So that was an interesting finding. So I wrote notes at the bottom of my slide that I can pose for the audience to comment and ask questions, because I think I have plenty of time if anyone wants to ask a question, or if something is in chat, please jump and tell me about it. But this is pretty solid. You know, in the keynote, we learned quite a bit about what AI can and cannot do. And, that essential part of human thinking that we have points to how can we use AI to actually improve some of the things that we're doing. This is pretty solid framework: contextual understanding, personalization, scalability, continuous learning, accessibility, language support, feedback mechanisms. So that's the background where, Copilot also shared some things and it was fed actually with some of my information along the way. Let me go to the next slide and check my notes.
Yes, it's great for next slide.
Okay. So basically, to simply say, all this experience and work and research that I have done before this project that I'm sharing about today is about intercultural communication, in which it's related also to transformative learning theory by Mezirow, where we're trying to potentially resolve a disorienting dilemma causing cognitive dissonance with an individual's perspective, belief, or worldview. So by qualitative analysis of third place learning dialogues scenarios using generative AI within these relational dimension, this research has the potential, and please notice, has the potential because there is lots of work to be done, to inform about the possibilities of creating innovative transformative learning experiences. So this reflective inquiry is also focused on what are necessary conditions for this process of perspective sharing and perspective taking to lead to the shared understanding or resolution of a disorientation. And I gave one example. It's also my personal experience collaborating with some friends from India, where their sense of punctuality, meeting at 2 actually really means maybe meeting between 2 and 2:15, things like that. So a very good friend of mine would explain to me, let's always schedule it like that. We'll meet between 2 and 2:15, things like that. So we had those conversations about different ways of thinking about it. And this is a simple example. There are more complex ones. The next slide is to point at what it really means to have a different perspective. So if you are familiar with children's book, Fish is Fish, it's what fish was visualizing when the frog came back and shared about what she has seen. So this is how the fish visualized a cow. And as the frog was explaining, fish continue to visualize people, children, birds, but as you see, everything was in the form of a fish. So that's one way to really understand how these disorienting dilemmas actually give us a different perspective than what our original thinking is. Just recognizing how relevant the context and understanding and prior knowledge are important. So perspective taking, we formally can define as seeing the world through the eyes of another person and adding a new perspective to one's viewpoint or meaning structure. And I already mentioned some examples. When I offered this description to Leonardo, which I use sometimes for figures and images, this is the image that popped up that I have on this slide. And then I was curious what Copilot might offer me. So the first was, this is a perspective how Copilot was thinking about it, and it was offering some choices for me. So I made this choice. I said, change it to a scene where two people are having a conversation and trying to understand each other's point of view. So these are the images generated by Copilot. And, you know, we could have some conversations. Some are better, some are not so good, but it gives you some idea that two people are having different perspectives on certain things. I want to mention this because it's relevant and it's very much related to the keynote that we heard today. Perspective taking is a form of social rather than technical proficiency, and it can actually be learned. And that's one of the significant small points that I got from Ethan Mollick when he was talking about whether we should or should not anthropomorphize AI, treating it as a person. So his arguments are that, you know, some things are just easier if we are metaphorically accept it as a person, but of course with this awareness of what that really means. And here is my visual of the process of perspective sharing and perspective taking that I would like you to take a moment to look at. And I'll take a second a break. As I say, central to TPL is an intercultural heuristic that comprises strategies for sharing and taking perspectives. So, you know, there are colloquial phrases that we use saying walking in someone's shoes. And the phrase is simple and kind of sounds understandable, but if you try really to get into the essence of it, it's taking a perspective of another person can be quite complex. And then even more, if you want to carry on conversation in which you ask for other person's perspective, but recognizing your context. Here is another example of disorienting dilemma that I learned from a friend in Japan. She was talking about some businessmen wanting her to take them some places over the weekend, and for her, that kind of impossible because she needed to be with her family, but she has a problem of saying no. So in the workshop that I mentioned in Japan, we had lots of conversation about different ways of indirect way how they would communicate something compared what typically we might say here more directly. I cannot spend this weekend with you. I have to be with my family. So that was another interesting example that we used and studied in this context of third place learning. So to define more formally disorienting dilemma, which I'm pretty sure you know, it's a feeling of discomfort or tension that results when an individual perceives that his or her particular worldview is being questioned, the tension between knowledge and experience. And I just share the example, I can't say no. My other example is a disruptive student. This was something that was brought up when we did a workshop in India. Someone shared how they had experience in the States where students can interrupt and ask questions, which is kind of not acceptable in their context that they were talking about. So this is about communication. So it's important to recognize what are dimensions or conditions, or actually what I call a relational criteria, because it's about relationship between two people or two groups of people that should support efficient and communication in resolving a disorienting dilemma. So here are some relevant relational criteria that I'm sure you are already familiar with. Active listening. There is this whole theory, in case you haven't heard about it before, Enryo Sashi model, which actually comes from Japan, and it is about direct versus indirect communication, how differently we process things, and how that active listening actually is not just simple repeating what other person said, but really processing in a way to understand the context where the message is coming from. So if anyone is interested, I probably have some references about that. So I'll just go back to my fish and frog. Cows, said the frog to fish. Cows, they have 4 legs, horns, eat grass, and carry pink bags of milk. So think for a moment to just forget what you know about cows, and you can imagine that fish was reasoning in some, it's a story, but I love it because I used to teach also mathematics for elementary teachers, and I wanted them to understand how important it is, prior knowledge and context, and what students know or don't know. Another relational criteria that I want to bring up here is cultural sensitivity. It may be described as feelings and attitudes toward our own and other cultures. And there are different states of cultural sensitivity, and I will not go into those details. I was more interested, of course, how to bring this into the connection with using artificial intelligence and specifically Copilot. So here's a slide that I got from Copilot when I asked the question, could you provide an example of cultural sensitivity in a third place learning dialogue? I do want to say that I had series of entries into the Copilot that introduced relational criteria in third place learning dialogue. And as it was mentioned in the keynote today, it's interesting that if I came the next day and put the same prompt, I would get a little bit different answer. But this is one that I captured. So the example is relatively simple. It's a cultural sensitivity related to holidays. And in this case, it's an example in which teacher is facilitating the process in a way of being aware and sharing, allowing students to share about holidays that they're familiar with. And in this case, it was about Diwali, the Festival of Lights in India, and Christmas that another student brought to the conversation. And some point here is, coming to this reciprocal sharing that recognizes cultural sensitivity. The interesting tidbit here is in the co-pilot, this is the ending comment. This example illustrates how cultural sensitivity can be practiced in a TPL dialogue. It involves recognizing and respecting cultural differences, avoiding assumptions, and being open-minded and willing to learn from others. This approach fosters an inclusive learning environment where all students feel valued and understood. I do want to point here that I kept the text in a way it was coming out in the Copilot with links and references, which, as we know, in the first stages of GPT, references were sometimes wrong and there were no quotations. But in this case, I checked some of those and they really seem correctly pulled out from different sources. And I will not go into, kind of making judgment about how good this is or not, because that's not my goal at this point. But I do want to point at the elements that Copilot brought in this example here, for example. Of course, I was intrigued to try something opposite, to say, what about cultural insensitivity? Can you provide an example like that? Which this is the example that captures lack of cultural sensitivity, dismissive attitude, and ignoring cultural differences. It's again an example from a classroom and constructed, I will say constructed by whatever the processes are behind AI by using some of the references, but not everything is pulled out directly, which I find interesting. Dialectic thinking is a next very relevant relational criteria because it requires to really work with different perspectives. The essence is in being able to think about in terms of dialectic theoretical formats. And it's important to cultivate dialectic thinking in the process of third place learning. And Leonardo produced this picture when I provided the text, a way of thinking and sometimes a way of conversing with others by which we either refute or establish some propositions by means of question and answer. So this was the image for dialectic thinking that Copilot provided. I didn't do much prompting there. I just used the picture. And this is the comment on dialectic thinking. So I didn't provide all the pieces, but basically focusing on the synthesis or resolution and how the Copilot actually used the acronym correctly and said this example illustrates how dialectic thinking fosters learning in a TPL dialogue. It encourages students to engage in argumentative practices, consider alternative viewpoints, and so on. I won't read all of this for you. I'm a teacher that like interaction, so this kind of lecturing here is not very much my style, but I can do it. So, it's text. It's kind of listening to, analyzing the text. Does it make sense with Is this what I would say? What is the source? Things like that. So I'm also a visual person. I'm editor of the Journal of Mathematics and the Arts. So I have spent time figuring out what is the relationship of art and artificial intelligence, but I won't talk about it. But when I get kind of a little bit bored, then I'm like asking this question: is there an image of dialectic thinking that you could share? And Copilot said, I'm sorry for any confusion, but as a text-based AI, I'm unable to directly share images. However, I can describe the concept of dialectic thinking in a way that might help you visualize it. You can imagine this as a triangle where the thesis and antithesis form the base corners and the synthesis forms the peak. This represents the journey of an idea starting from a proposition, which is thesis, encountering a contradiction, and finally resolving into a new refined idea synthesis. So, I was surprised. It's telling me about a triangle. So can you draw a triangle where the thesis and antithesis form the base corners and the synthesis forms the peak? Obviously, I kind of used the text that Copilot provided. And this is what I got. And it's interesting. If you pay attention, the labels are on the sides, the synthesis is on the bottom and not on the top. So this is actually an essential evidence of what we heard in the keynote today also, about this putting things together, not really understanding what the meaning is, even though the sentence was very precise, what are the corners of this triangle? So a long way to go to kind of trust these sources a bit more. Next relational criteria that's important to promote is conscientization, or simply put, recognition of power relationships in conversations about disorienting dilemma. So it's the process of being actively aware of oppression by a dominant group. So these are examples: student, teacher, employee, boss, ethnic minority. So it's difficult in a situation like that to really have a constructive conversation unless it's recognized, unless the power distance is lowered in some way. One of my favorite relational criteria that I have studied with a friend who is American Japanese is Bodymindfulness. And the term is used a little bit differently in today's, everyday literature. But the way she defined it, her name is Adera Nagata. I'm sorry, I missed to put her name here. It's the state of situational awareness and the process of conscious control over one's thoughts and behavior relative to the situation and in all learning domains. So it's really not just only what we are thinking, it's a cognitive, emotional, and somatic domain that we have. So I think about it as these three circles where the mindfulness is really in the intersection of these circles. Okay, so I'm like, Copilot should be able to generate an image like that. So my question, can you draw intersection of three circles? And I actually, as you can see under the picture, I said 3 overlapping circles with shared intersection. And I got these interesting images, but definitely not what I was asking for. So in the previous slide, I basically drew 3 circles that are overlapping to make my point about cognitive, emotional, and psychomotor or somatic characteristics that we have. Another and maybe essential relational criteria is facilitating critical co-reflection, not just reflection, but co-reflecting to really get into a deeper, more probing form of dialogic reflection that may question existing assumptions concerning power relations. So examples, disruptive student scenario. What is a good outcome for the teacher and for the student to understand each other and in the context of recognized power relationship? I think I'll give you a second to read this and then I'll say something more about it. And I brought this slide in for two reasons. One, it was inspiration for the title of our book. Yes, we called it Third Place Learning to kind of differentiate in terms of it was a better fit for what we were thinking, but it was also emphasizing to what that really mean. And I like sometimes writing the whole phrase third place learning as one word, because it is really conceptually, with multiple representations, one concept. So this is from the Location of Culture that Baba wrote, and it also is reflective of this situation here, where the words that we're putting in have meaning of or intuition that we as humans have, and then they become just I sometimes think about it as dots in graphs that are helping AI formulate or construct sentences that sometimes might not make sense. So, as I said, I'm also a mathematician, so mathematical modeling is interesting to me, and this is a very simple way to abstractly say TPL is a certain construct that combines or starts from disorienting dilemma and requires all these relational criteria to actually get to the place of mutual understanding. So obviously, this is something that I have done quite a bit of research, and both qualitative and quantitative. And for qualitative research, it was important to, I don't expect you to read this slide. It's here just to say for whatever relational criteria we're talking about, there are some essential words that describe or capture that criteria that in the research of data analysis of different dialogues can bring to the surface whether a certain relational criteria is observed or not. So that's one of the major challenges in this project that I'm working on, and not just by myself, with some colleagues, but I'll tell more about it. It is how to carry on dialogues while keeping in mind all these necessary relational criteria. So that the whole idea of having an AI assistant that would recognize these relational criteria is a complex task, and I'm not as far as I would like to be in this research. So one more thing here on dialectic thinking that that Copilot provided. It was related to climate change, which I found interesting. I'll give you a second to see the example before I go to talk more about dialogue with Simia. So going back to my prior research with the colleague that I mentioned that I wrote the book and the team that we had at the time, we have designed certain simulations and have been collecting data to figure out the best way to carry on these conversations. And so some of the process I'm kind of trying to imitate through use of AI, developing an AI assistant that would communicate with a student through this process of third place learning. But before I go into the details, here is just a picture of, at the time we called it cage painting simulator. And cage painting in this case is a metaphor where those cages actually represent things that about us that other person might not know, and how do we get to understand. It's a metaphor that was, I will not remember now the name of the person that first introduced it, and we use that source to kind of make visuals of this painting the cages bar as you learn about other person. So in that simulator, basically, these conversations that we had between, let me go back here so you can see this. We call the one person Simia. That would be your collaborator when you are on simulator. So you carry on a conversation with a simulator, but along the way, you have to pay attention to these relational criteria. Okay, so going back to this here, for the rest of this presentation, what I want to share with you is how I'm trying to use this knowledge that I have using scenario templates and examples to train AI TPL assistant. So the idea is to have an assistant. When I put some things in, it should be able to recognize whether relational criteria are used in the process of resolving a certain disorienting dilemma. So So how I'm envisioning this? This is just a snippet of the scenario, the first beginning, setting the context, challenge or goal. I gave you already some examples. So here is one example from my students. I had a visually impaired student in one of my classes, and then she was also in this graduate program where we have been doing some things with third place learning. So they decided to design a scenario in which this blind student is in a math classroom where lots of visual work is expected. So that's a disorienting dilemma both for a student and a teacher, because teacher is using lots of visuals and student doesn't have that capability. So students have established here the context and established the challenge or goal, and then the scenario moves along the following, we call them points: learning point 1, learning point 2, learning point. But basically, they are about moving through the process of learning about someone's perspective, sharing your perspective, share something about yourself, but from other person's perspective, and then ask a question so the person can answer it from your perspective, help you actually resolve a disorienting dilemma. So this is like a formal framework that has been used for these templates. So I will share a few other ones. So how does that look? For example, learning point 1 is asking for Simia's perspective. So remember, Simia is like a general name for the person in this simulation. And there are certain choices, and they are here colored as good. Green is, of course, the best choice, and red is the bad choice, and like 2 mediocre choices. So think about, and on the right side, you can see kind of suggestions how to go about it to help construct these statements. And that's where I'm actually now in the heart of work, to see how Copilot can handle this as an AI assistant that I'm developing separately, but I'm still in the process of programming some things that are not as obvious as they might look here. So, and my students tell me, I also have students in classes kind of doing these different scenarios that they think about it. The latest one that they worked on is vegetarian person versus non-vegetarian and things like that. They always come up with interesting ideas. But they tell me that it's relatively easy to have a good answer, like what's the best answer in a situation, and then also to have like a better answer, but finding something that's in between, it's not as easy, although they also say that in real life they feel that answers are most of the time someplace in the middle. I find that as an interesting comment. That's why I decided to share it. And here I just took a capture of one of the students' works to show you how it looks. And that's exactly how I'm also developing it in the using AI assistant. So then I listed learning points for you already. I'll just go back for a second because I'm going to jump to the number 4. Ask Simia a question so she answers from your perspective. I will say that for some students, this is like a relatively easy exercise. It comes natural to them. But I also have a number of students that this seems very confusing. And I'll mention a couple of years ago, Linda Hoffman was a student that was just designing these scenarios and filling the templates very easily. And she's one that worked on the punctuality scenario that I already shared with you. And she's now in Switzerland working for, I think, pharmaceutical company. So this was the learning point 4, where we kind of get to the more than one bad choice. Oh, and let me, can I answer any questions before I continue? And I don't see chat, so I will check it now. Okay, so my collaborator, Glenn Remington, who I mentioned because we wrote the book together, in the meantime, he retired and he's traveling 6 months in Australia, 6 months in the States, but we keep in touch. And I was like communicating a little bit with him about how I'm trying to continue this project and what my students are doing. And he shared a couple of slides about his own thinking, how this process should continue. And he was just working with ChatGPT, I think, version 4. And this is the list, how he is thinking about it. I hope you can see it because I think I'll just read them. provide background experience of each character, detail the context, which is similar as the scenarios that I have, provide an example with the style that you desire, describe the level audience, and provide feedback to converge on what you were interested in and keep iterating. So that's exactly what I was doing with Copilot, trying to iterate to see if there is some convergence based on those prompts that I'm providing so that I can feel more comfortable that what I'm getting is closer to my intent. Because as we know, intent is a human characteristic. So here he goes on to provide an example, which I find interesting. Darla grew up and went to school in a small Midwest farming town many miles from the nearest city. She never encountered African Americans or Latino children or adults. She traveled with her family once to a national park in a neighboring state. She and her family used Fox News as their sole news source, along with the local daily newspaper. She learned from her elders about the evils of a big city life and the dangers of foreigners, especially those we fought against in wars. But here another detail of the context, because it's leading to a disorienting dilemma that we need in order to develop this scenario. Darla travels to another country in Southeast Asia where she interacts with locals who are selling food in stalls on the street. It is hot and humid. It is noisy. There are many strange smells, some not so pleasant. She is hungry, but all the offerings appear very strange. She exchanged US dollars for some of the local currency. She is not sure how much it is worth. The languages being spoken are not English. So that would be starting a disorienting dilemma, which in this case actually is probably more than one dilemma. You can focus on food differences, currency, or language. And my colleague has this style where he just crosses the things that we are done with, provide background, detail the context. The next one is provide an example with the style that you desire. So what is always very useful, and I'm sure you remember many books and movies that can be used for intercultural interactions. What is also good about these examples from literature and from the movies is that they are more like imaginary cases, so people feel more comfortable when discussing them versus discussing their own disorienting dilemma. And the audience is essential. The intended audience comprises people who want to learn how to handle intercultural, interlinguistic interactions in an international context. This story is meant to help the audience learn how to improve their intercultural interactions. So as you can recognize, I'm sure, the main challenge is designing this AI assistant is how to nurture, again, human word that's not easily understood, that all these situations are respectful of the relational criteria.
Hi, Mara. We only have the 3 seconds, 3 minutes, and we have the 1 questions. Could you go into the Q&A sessions?
Yes, of course.
And I will move our chair, go on stage.
Sorry, what's the question?
I think we have 1 question is, could you please explain how chatbots can use in dialogue learning?
Yes, but I mean, chatbots are just a type of AI assistant. So that's exactly what I'm trying to develop with my students, but using these specific scenarios that I already described here, and framing it with relational criteria challenges. And that's where the real challenge happens, because as you realize, some of these relational criteria really have these human characteristics that's not easily demonstrated through chatbots. Does that answer the question?
Thank you so much. I think that is most of the questions, and thank you for sharing your information for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.